The augurs never knocked. They had already watched the door open, somewhere in the branching arithmetic of the next 4 seconds. And so to them, the door was already open, and they came through it before Rika's hand had finished reaching for the latch. Kurt, there were 2 of them. They filled the stairwell the way water fills a glass, without hurry, finding the shape of the space and settling into it. They were tall and segmented, and the wrong kind of symmetrical, plated in something that was not quite shell and not quite metal, and along the seams of them ran a slow tidal light, blue, going to white, going to blue, the way they spoke to one another and to the vast cold mind that held them. They did not have faces. They had the place where a face would be, and that place was worse. She had been carrying a kettle. She remembered that later, the way you remember the stupid, small thing your hands were doing. At the moment, the world ended. A kettle, still warm, the steam of it curling up between her and the 2 creatures who had come to read her. They read her the way you might glance at a stone to see if it would fall. It was a pressure behind her eyes, a sensation like being looked up in a ledger, and then the light along their bodies steadied into a flat, unbothered rhythm, and they turned and went back down the stairs. And that was how Rika learned that she had already surrendered. Not in any moment she could point to. They had simply run the sum of her fear, her exhaustion, the rational arithmetic of a woman alone in an occupied city, with nothing left to lose that she had not already lost. And the answer had come out compliant, and a compliant human was not worth the cost of killing. She was noise that had resolved into silence. She was safe because she was finished. She stood in the stairwell a long time after they had gone. The kettle cooled in her hands. Outside, across the drowned lower wards where the seawalls had failed in the first year, and no one had been permitted to rebuild them, the evening tide came in over the rooftops and the streetlights burned underwater, green and patient, and far up the dark slope of the hills. The augur spire stood with its own light, turning, the way a lighthouse turns, except that a lighthouse is built to keep from the rocks, and the spire was built to keep the future from surprising anyone. This is what the world had become in the 3 years since they came. Not rubble, not fire. Everyone had braced for fire. The films had all promised fire. What came instead was arithmetic. The augurs arrived in a swarm of cold bodies that fell out of the August sky during the meteor shower, so that for one night people had stood in their gardens and on their balcony and pointed up and made wishes on the falling lights, not knowing, and that was the joke the universe had told and never explained. By morning the things were in the cities. They did not demand surrender. They demonstrated, instead, that surrender had already happened. They showed the generals the battles they were about to lose, move for move, down to the names of the dead. They showed the holdouts, the precise hour and manner of their capture. They were never wrong, and being never wrong, they did not need to be cruel. People shown its own defeat in such fine detail will mostly walk toward it on its own feet, to get the thing over with, to stop the dread. That was the discovery the augurs had made, somewhere out in the long dark of their travels, and had refined into a method that you do not need to break a species if you can simply tell it the truth about itself. Ka had believed for a while that she was an exception. Everyone believes that for a while. She had kept the wishes after all. Before the augurs, in the soft years there had been Star. It had started as nothing, a little civilian thing, a constellation of cheap satellites and a phone application that listened. You spoke your wish into it. The small ones, mostly, the kind that aren't worth telling a person. Please let the test come back clean. Please let him text me back. Please let Mum laugh again like she used to. And Star logged it, time-stamped it, threw it up into the constellation, and kept it. It was meant to be sentimental. People made wishes during the August meteor shower, and the servers groaned under the weight of all that wanting. And the next year they would scroll back and read what they had hoped for and laugh or cry at the people they had been. Rika had built part of it. She had been one of the engineers who kept the listening side running, the warehouses of murmured hopes, the indexes of human longing, sorted by date and place, and the trembling in a voice. The augurs had shut down every human network within a week of landing. The military nets, the financial nets, the grids, all of it, folded into their own lattice or simply switched off. but they had left Star running. She had wondered why in the early days, and then she had understood, and the understanding had been the first thing that frightened her more than the creatures themselves. They left Star running because to them it was noise. It logged wishes. Wishes were, by the cold mathematics of the lattice, the purest noise a mind could produce. Projections of impossible futures, requests addressed to no one, statements about the world that the world had already declined to make true. There was no information in a wish. A wish was the sound a system makes when it is broken. The augurs pruned noise the way you breathe. They had glanced at Star, found nothing in it that could change a prediction, and left it spinning, untouched, beneath their notice. A constellation of the one thing in all the world they could not be bothered to switch off. And so Rika kept the wishes. She maintained the listening side, out of a stubbornness she could not have explained. In a flooded city, for a species that no longer made them. Daiki found her. The night, it all turned, sitting cross-legged on the floor of the dry upper room, with the old terminal in her lap, and the constellation murmuring its archived hopes into her earpiece. She had been listening to the year before the augurs. A man wishing his daughter would call. A girl wishing she were braver. The ordinary, unbearable weather of a species that still believed tomorrow was negotiable. She knew, before he said anything, that something in him had broken loose. He had been the bravest person she knew. He had been the one, in the first year, who organized the holdouts in the drowned wards, who moved them through the tide streets at the hours the spire's light was turned away, who taught her how to be small, how to be quiet, how to keep her wanting low and rational so the reader's gaze would slide off her. He had a half-smile he used, when a plan was working, a private little crook of the mouth, and she had loved that half-smile more than she had ever told him, because telling him would have raised the temperature of her hope above safe levels. And she had been so careful. They had both been so careful. To want only what was reasonable. He was not smiling now. His face had the flat, settled calm she had seen on the augur's light, and that was how she knew, even before he held out the slate to her. It was a prediction. They had given it to him. They did that now, to the organizers, the stubborn ones, as a kindness, as an efficiency. It showed him the next 11 months in clean gray certainty. It showed the holdouts taken. One by one, the streets they would be taken in, the small betrayals, the failures of nerve, the exact configuration of the end. It showed her in it. It showed her taken on a winter morning at the foot of the hill road, and it gave the date, and she did not look away from the date, though everything in her wanted to. He said the only words he would say to her that night, and they were not cruel, and that was the worst of it. He said, "It was always going to end this way. Tired of pretending I can't see it." Then he set the slate down on the floor between them, gently, the way you set down something that is already dead. And he stood, and he went down the stairs and out into the tide streets, and he did not look back. And the door did not even bang because there was no wind. There was never any wind anymore. The augurs had even taken the weather and made it predictable. She did not chase him. There would have been no point. The prediction had her not chasing him. Diction had everything. She sat with the dead slate, and the murmuring constellation, and the cooling night, and she understood that the wound he had given her was not that he had left. It was that he had agreed with them. He had looked at the arithmetic of his own life, and found it correct and folded, the way you fold a losing hand. He had become, in the only way that mattered, one of them. A thing that did only what could be predicted of it. The man who had taught her to keep her wanting low had finally let his go out entirely. And here was the cruelty she could not forgive, lying there in the dark, with the earpiece still whispering other people's hopes into her skull, that he was almost certainly right. She did not sleep. Somewhere near the bottom of the night, when the spire's light had swung to the far side of the hill, and the room was as dark as it ever got, she did the thing that she would later understand had no rational payoff whatsoever. The thing the prediction could not have contained because it would have pruned it as noise the instant it appeared. She scrolled the archive back, not to her own wishes. She could not have borne her own. She scrolled it back and out, across the city, across the year before the end. And she began, for no reason she could have defended to anyone, to follow them. to listen to the wishes of strangers and to want with a hunger that frightened her, to know whether any of them had ever come true. That was how the journey began, not with a plan. With a woman in a flooded city following the thread of other people's hope backward into the dark, because the man she loved had stopped believing in his own. She left at the turning of the tide, with the terminal in a waxed bag against her chest and the earpiece in end, and the constellations steering her by the wishes themselves. Star knew where they had been spoken. Every hope was pinned to the place and the hour of its speaking, and so the archive was also a map of where people had stood when they let themselves want something, and Rika walked it. The first wish took her north along the tide line to a fisherman's slip, where the boats lay rotting at angles in the silted water. A man had stood here in the summer before the end, and wished. She heard his voice in her ear, gravel and salt, and a laugh underneath it. That the season would be kind enough that he could buy his grandson the good rod, the real one, not the toy. She stood where he had stood. The slip was empty. The boats were bones. She did not know if the season had been kind, if the rod had been bought, if the grandson had grown into a man, or been taken to the relocation wards in the second winter with everyone else. She found, scratched into the rail of the slip with a knife in a child's clumsy hand, a small picture of a fish, and beside it the careful letters of a name and a date from the autumn after the wish. And she understood that the rod had been bought. The grandson had stood on this slip and caught something and was proud enough to carve it. And she sat down on the rotting boards and cried for the first time in a year, for a man and a boy she had never met, over a fish that no longer mattered to anyone alive. It here as the fisherman's slip that she first saw the thing she would spend of her life trying to explain to people who had not seen it. An auger came down the tide line, a single one, on patrol, its light turning in its slow tidal blue, the pressure of its reading running ahead of it like a cold wind. Rika did the rational thing. She froze, and she made herself small, and she lowered her, wanting the way Daiki had taught her, smoothed herself flat and gray and compliant, a stone that would not fall. And the auger's gaze passed over her and resolved her as silence and moved on, exactly as it always had, and she let her breath out. But there had been a child further up the slip. She had not seen the child until the auger was nearly on it. A small girl, 8 perhaps 10, crouched in the lee of a beached hull, and the girl was not being small and gray and compliant at all. The girl was doing something with her hands, something fierce and absorbed and entirely irrational. Building a little structure out of wet stones and bottle caps and the green glass the tide brought in. Building it with the total seriousness of a child building the one thing in the world that matters. And Rika could see, even from here, even in the dark, that the child was wishing on it, that the structure was a wish, that the girl had decided, against all the arithmetic of the occupied world, that if she built it just so, something impossible would happen. The auger reached the girl. Rika's heart stopped, and the auger's gaze slid off her, not past her, off her. Rika watched the creature's light stutter, a single, skipped beat in the long tidal rhythm, a flicker like a held breath, as the reading ran over the child and found, where there should have been a clean resolvable human, only static. Only a small fierce nod of wanting, the impossible, of acting toward an outcome the lattice had already pruned to zero. The auger could not see her, could not be bothered, could not. The child was doing the one thing the predictive mind discards in order to function at all, the noise it must throw away to keep the future tractable. And in doing it, she had stepped out of the forecast entirely, become a gap in the arithmetic, a hole in the world the size of a wish. The auger paused, its light skipping, trying to resolve a thing that by its own deepest logic could not be there. And then it did what they always did with noise. It looked away. It moved on up the tide line, and the child went on building her impossible thing. Never knowing she had been invisible, never knowing she had been the most powerful person on the drowned coast for the length of a held breath. Rika sat very still in the dark for a long time after both of them had gone. She thought about Daiki's slate, about the prediction that had everything in it, her capture, her date, the whole gray certain machinery of the end. And she thought, the prediction had everything in it except the things no one would do on purpose. It had her fear and her hunger and her grief. because those were rational, those resolved, those could be summed. It did not have the girl with the bottle caps. It could not have had her. Wish is the one input the lattice is built to throw away. She did not understand yet what to do with this. She understood that it was the first true thing she had learned since the sky fell, and she got up, and she went on, following the wishes north, and she began to listen to them differently. Not as grief. As reconnaissance, the journey took 11 days. She would think about that number later, against the months of the prediction, and find something in it that was either meaning or coincidence, and decide it did not matter which. She followed an old woman's wish to a temple on the hill, where the woman had asked, the summer before the end, only that she be allowed to die in her own bed and not in a ward. Enrica found the bed, and the woman in it, 3 years dead and undisturbed, because the relocation crews had marked the house compliant and empty, and the prediction had not bothered with a corpse. Enrica closed the woman's door and stood a moment and was, absurdly, glad. The wish had been granted. The world had let one small, impossible thing through. She followed a soldier's wish to a checkpoint long abandoned. A man who had wished. And she could hear the shake in him, the wet eyes behind the voice. That he would not be a coward when it came. And she never learned whether he had been, but she found his rifle stacked neatly with 40 others in the guardhouse. Surrendered in good order, and she found scratched into the concrete above them, in the same hand as the duty log, 3 words that were not a regret. They were instructions to whoever came after. They said, keep the wishes. She did not know how he had known. She decided he had not known anything, had only felt the shape of the one thing the readers could not take, and named it the way a dying man names the last thing he loves. And on the 9th day, in a flooded substation, where the constellation's signal pooled strongest, she made herself do the thing she had been avoiding since the first night. She scrolled the archive to Daiki. Not to the man who had set the slate down and walked into the tide streets without looking back. To the man before. To a wish he had made in the second summer. After the augurs, but before the holdouts. When there had still been enough of him left to want something out loud, she almost couldn't play it. Her thumb hovered. The rational thing was to leave it, to not reopen the wound, to keep her wanting low. She played it anyway, and that, she would realize much later, was the second time she had stepped out of the forecast, the second hole she had made in the world, and she had not even noticed herself doing it. His voice in her ear was younger than she remembered. It had the half-smile in it. She could hear the half-smile. He said, into a constellation he must have known by then was being ignored by the things that ruled the sky. He said, I wish I could believe we'll get out of this. Not that we will. I know the numbers. I just wish I could believe it anyway. For her. So she's not the only one in the room still hoping. Rika sat in the flooded substation with the green underwater light coming through the broken windows. And she understood, finally, what had happened to Daiki. He had not stopped hoping because he was a coward. He had stopped because he had been hoping for her sake. And the math had finally worn him down to the place where the pretense cost more than it gave. And he had set it down the way you set down something too heavy to carry alone. He had needed her to hope so that he could borrow it. And she had been so careful, so rational, so flat and gray and safe that she had never once let him see her do it. She had kept her burn low to survive, and, in keeping it low, she had left him in the room alone. She did not cry this time. Something harder than crying happened to her in the green light of the substation. Something that set like a bone. She knew what Star was now, not an archive. Not a graveyard of granted and ungranted hopes. It was a channel. The one channel the augurs did not watch, would never watch, could not bring themselves to watch. Because to monitor the wish channel would mean ingesting noise into the lattice on purpose, corrupting the very arithmetic that made them what they were. It was a frequency that ran straight through the middle of their empire. And they had nailed the door open and walked past it for 3 years because they could not conceive that anything that mattered could be transmitted on it. And the August shower was 11 days out. The anniversary. The night the things had fallen. The night a whole planet had stood in its gardens and made wishes at the sky without knowing what the sky was bringing. She had heard, in the tide streets, the rumor of what the augurs meant to do with the anniversary. A resolution, they called it in the few human words that had leaked out of the compliant administration. A final pass of the lattice, the spires going bright all at once to read every human on Earth at depth and lock the forecast solid, to make the predicted future not merely likely but fixed. A planet of people who would do only and forever what could be predicted of them. The end of noise. The end of the gap. The end of the girl with the bottle caps. Rika walked home along the tide line, with a plan that was not a plan, because a plan can be predicted, but a wish cannot. Here is the thing, she understood, walking, that she would later have to make 100 frightened people understand in the 11 days she had. That they could not fight. Fighting was modeled. The lattice had run every battle and won every one before it started. They could not flee. Flight was modeled. The relocation wards stood ready. They could not even resist cleverly, because cleverness is rational, and the rational was the augur's native country. There was exactly one thing a human could do that the lattice could not see coming, and it was the most useless thing in the world. And that was precisely why it would work. Could want the impossible, out loud, all at once, and act on it. Not because acting would help, but because the wanting itself was the only territory the enemy had ceded. They could make a wish so large and so coordinated that it punched a hole in the arithmetic the size of a city, across the size of a planet. She did not have to convince them of much in the end. That was the small mercy. The holdouts in the drowned wards had spent 3 years being told the truth about themselves, and had grown sick to death of the truth. She came back among them with the terminal and against thought's chest and the constant live in her hand, and played them the fisherman and the old woman and the soldier and the girl-shaped hole the augur could not look at. When she played them last, a man's young voice wishing he could believe, for the sake of a woman who would not let him see her hope. They did not argue with the arithmetic. They had never been able to argue with the arithmetic. She offered them, instead, a way to step out of it, and a people that has been crushed by certainty will give almost anything for 1 hour of the unpredictable. They seeded it through star. That was the genius of it, and the only part that required engineering. Enrica had built the listening side, so she knew the bones of it. 3 years the constellation had only listened. Now she turned it around. She rebuilt the downlink out of the dead grid, out of salvaged repeaters, and a tower in the hills that the augurs had left standing because it broadcast nothing but noise. And she made stars speak, not in words. The augurs would notice words. Words carry information. Words resolve. She made it speak in wishes. She pushed the archive back down out of the sky. All of it. 3 years of granted and ungranted human hope. The fisherman and the old woman and the soldier and 10 million strangers, into every earpiece and speaker and broken phone that could still catch the frequency. Across the drowned wards, and up the hill roads and out. She had to believe, far past the edge of the coast, because the constellation covered the world, and the world was full of people who had been waiting 3 years for permission to want something again. The augurs felt it. Of course they felt it. On the 9th night, the spire on the hill flared and held, its light no longer turning but fixed and searching. And the patrols thickened in the tide streets, and the pressure of their reading lay over the whole city like weather. They knew something was rising. They could feel the noise floor climbing, the static thickening, 10,000 small, irrational knots of wanting. The impossible flickering on at once, across their immaculate forecast, like a fever breaking out across a body. But they could not resolve it. They ran the lattice, and the lattice returned the same answer it always returned. Compliance, surrender. A planet walking toward its predicted end on its own feet. Because the lattice was built to prune exactly the thing that was rising, and so the rising was invisible to it, even as it choked the air. The augurs stood in their stuttering light and were, for the first time in 3 years, afraid in the only way a predictive mind can be afraid. Not of an enemy, but of a gap. A blank place in the future where the arithmetic returned no value. A hole the shape of a wish growing. On the 11th night, the shower came. Tsass. Rika stood on the roof of the dry upper room where Daiki had set the slate down and walked away. And she watched the first of the lights streak down out of the August dark, the same shower that had carried the augurs 3 years ago. the same patient sky telling the same old joke. And below her, in the tide streets, and on the hill roads, and along the broken seawalls, the people of the drowned city began to come out of their houses. The lattice had predicted this night, down to the dead. It had the resolution mapped, the spires bright, the readings deep, the future locking solid at the appointed hour. It had every human on the coast accounted for, fleeing, or hiding, or kneeling, or making the last doomed rush at the spire that the forecast had already broken before it began. It had run every rational response to the end of the world, and prepared for all of them. It had not predicted that they would walk out into the open and look up. That was all. That was the whole of it. The most useless thing in the world. They came out of their houses in their thousands, the holdouts and the compliant and the broken and the brave. And they did not run, and they did not fight, and they did not kneel. They walked out into the streets, where the augurs could see them plainly, where the readings were deepest and the danger highest. And they tilted their heads back. And as the shower came down, they made wishes on it, out loud, together, into the night, and into the constellation that carried their wanting up past the spires and the patrols and the cold lattice mind. 10 million voices wishing for the one thing the arithmetic said could not happen, wishing not because it would help. They knew it would not help. That was the whole point. That was the entire terrible genius of it, but because wanting the impossible together was the one act left in all the world that the enemy could not see coming, and the augurs went blind. Rika watched it happen from the roof. The spire on the hill flared to its full searching brilliance, the resolution beginning, reaching out to read the city at depth and lock it down, and met where 10,000 resolvable humans should have been, 10,000 holes, 10,000 girls with bottle caps, a whole city acting. All at once, on pure unalloyed wish, every rational signal stripped away and only the pruned noise remaining, so that the lattice reaching out to read them found nothing to read. Only static, only gap, only the roaring blank place in the future where its arithmetic returned no value and could return none. The spire's light stuttered, skipped. The long tidal certainty of it broke into a frantic flickering, the way the patrol's light had broken over a single child on the tide line. Except that now it was a planet's worth of children. Now it was everyone. Now there was nowhere for the gaze to slide off to, because everywhere it turned was the same impossible noise. The lattice was a mind built on prediction. It had no other organ. When the future returned no value, when the one thing it had always pruned came roaring back at the scale of a world, it did the only thing a mind made entirely of forecast can do when the forecast fails. Can't. It faulted. Up and down the coast the spires went dark, not destroyed, simply unable to function. The way an eye cannot function staring into static. The way arithmetic cannot continue when every term has gone to noise. Patrols in the tide streets froze mid-stride, their tidal light gone wild and stuttering, reading and finding only gaps, surrounded by a species that had stepped out of the world they knew how to live in. They had conquered 100 worlds, the augurs, by telling each one the truth about itself. They had never met a species that could choose all at once to become a lie, to want what could not be, to act on hope with no expectation of reward, and to do it together in such numbers that the wanting itself became a weather the lattice could not see through. Ka stood on the roof with the shower coming down and the spire dark on the hill, and she was wishing too. Of course she was. She had her head tilted back like all the rest, and what she wished, she let herself. First time in 3 years she let her wanting go all the way up, past safe, past rational, past the careful low flat gray thing she had made of herself to survive. What she wished was the most useless and impossible thing she could think of, and she wished it with everything in her, because that was the weapon, that was the only weapon. She wished that D.A. Key was still in the room with her, still hoping that he had not set it down after all. She did not hear him come up the stairs. There was no wind. There was never any wind. There was a step on the roof behind her. And she turned, and he was there, with the shower in his eyes, having walked back out of the predicted future on his own 2 feet because somewhere down in the tide streets, the constellation had reached him too. The archive coming down out of the sky, his own young voice wishing he could believe, and a city of strangers giving him permission to do the impossible thing he had set down because he thought he was the only one still trying to carry it. He did not say anything. The film of their life together had run out of words a long time ago. There had never been enough words for any of it. He only looked at her, and the half-smile came, the private little crook of the mouth he used when a plan was working. Except that this was not a plan. A plan can be predicted, and this was the other thing. The thing they had no name for. And Rika understood that the half-smile had never been about the plan at all. It had always been about her. It had always meant the same thing the wish meant. I am still in the room. You are not the only one hoping. Below them, in the dark where the spires had gone out, the augurs were leaving. Not fleeing. They did not know how to flee. It was not in the arithmetic, but withdrawing, folding their stuttering bodies back up into the cold sky they had fallen out of. Because a predictive mind cannot rule a world it cannot predict, and there is no profit, and no method, and no future at all in conquering a species that has learned to make itself into noise. They went up through the shower the way they had come down through it 3 years before, and the difference was that this time the whole drowned coast stood with its head tilted back and watched them go and went on wishing. Just to be sure, just to keep the gap open, just because it felt, after 3 years, so unbearably good to want something out loud. In the morning the tide went out and did not come all the way back. Someone, somewhere, had wished the seawalls whole. It would take years and hands, and not magic. Rika knew that. The wishing was only the beginning and the smallest part. The wishing only opened the door that the work would have to walk through. But the door was open. That was the thing. 3 years the future had been a closed gray certainty, and now it was a door, standing open with the wind coming through it. There was wind again. She noticed, standing on the roof in the thin gold morning, an ordinary, unpredictable wind off the sea, and no one alive could tell you what was going to come through it. Not the augurs, not the lattice, not the cold arithmetic of any mind in any sky, because the people of the earth had remembered the one trick that no sufficiently clever enemy can ever account for, which is that we will, given half a reason and sometimes none at all, want the impossible hard enough to make a hole in the world and climb through. Rika did not give a speech. There was no one to give it to. Everyone already knew. They had all stood in the streets and done it together, and the knowing was in their bodies now, deeper than words. She went back down into the dry upper room instead, where the dead slate still lay on the floor with its gray prediction of 11 months and a winter capture at the foot of the hill road. And she picked it up, and she looked at the date she had not been taken on, and she set it down again gently, the way you set down something that is finally truly dead. Then she took out the terminal, and she opened the listening side of Star, the side she had kept running for 3 years for a species that had forgotten how to use it. And she did the small, ordinary, impossible thing that the whole war had been fought to make possible again. She made a wish. She did not say it out loud, and she did not write down what it was. And the constellation logged it the way it had logged 10 million others, timed to the gold, morning after the night that the future broke open, pinned to the place where a woman had stood on a roof in a half-drowned city with the man she loved beside her, and the wind coming back off the sea. It was a small wish. It was not about the war or the augurs or the lattice or the saving of the world. It was the kind of wish that is not worth telling a person, the kind you can only tell the sky. Daiki was humming, beside her, low and tuneless, the way her mother used to hum on the 7th of July when Rika was very small, and they wrote their wishes on strips of colored paper and hung them in the bamboo for the stars to read. A melody with no words and no name that meant only, in the wordless language under all the words, that someone you loved was still in the room and still hoping, and would be now for as long as there were mornings. The shower was over. The sky was just the sky again, ordinary and blue and full of weather no one could predict. Somewhere up in it the constellation turned, carrying its cargo of human wanting, the noise that had broken an empire, the one frequency in all the cold reaches that the things from the dark had never learned to hear. Closed her eyes and tilted her head back out of old habit, though the shower was long gone, and let herself want it anyway, the impossible small thing, the way you are supposed to. The way the girl with the bottle caps had. The way her mother had taught her on summer nights, before any of them knew what the falling lights would one day bring, or what a frightened species would one day learn to throw back up at them. She wished, and the morning, for once did not know what would happen next.